Chapter 2 of the Poison Belt. This recording is in the public domain. The Poison Belt by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 2, entitled The Tide of Death. As we crossed the hall, the telephone bell rang, and we were the involuntary auditors of Professor Challenger's end of the ensuing dialogue. I say we, but no one within 100 yards could have failed to hear the booming of that monstrous voice, which reverberated through the house. His answers lingered in my mind.
Yes, of course, it is I. Yes, certainly, the Professor Challenger, the famous professor, who else? Of course, every word of it, otherwise I should not have written it. I shouldn't be surprised. There is every indication of it. Within a day or so at the furthest. Well, I can't help that, can I? Very unpleasant, no doubt, but I rather fancy it will affect more important people than you. There is no use whining about it. No, I couldn't possibly. You must take your chance. That's enough, sir. Nonsense. I have something more important to do than to listen to such twaddle.
He shut off with a crash and led us upstairs into a large airy apartment which formed his study. On the great mahogany desk 7 or 8 unopened telegrams were lying.
Really,
he said as he gathered them up, I begin to think that it would save my correspondents money if I were to adopt a telegraphic address. Possibly Noah Rotherfield would be the most appropriate. As usual, when he made an obscure joke, he leaned against the desk and bellowed in a paroxysm of laughter, his hands shaking so that he could hardly open the envelopes.
Noah, Noah,
he gasped with a face of beetroot, while Lord John and I smiled in sympathy, and Summerlee, like a dyspeptic goat, wagged his head in sardonic disagreement. Finally, Challenger, still rumbling and exploding, began to open his telegrams. The three of us stood in the bow window and occupied ourselves in admiring the magnificent view. It was certainly worth looking at. The road in its gentle curves had really brought us to a considerable elevation, 700 feet, as we afterwards discovered. Challenger's house was on the very edge of the hill, and from its southern face, in which was the study window, one looked across the vast stretch of the Weald to where the gentle curves of the South Downs formed an undulating horizon. In a cleft of the hills, a haze of smoke marked the position of Lewes. Immediately at our feet there lay a rolling plain of heather, with the long vivid green stretches of the Crowborough golf course, all dotted with the players. A little to the south, through an opening in the woods, we could see a section of the main line from London to Brighton. In the immediate foreground, under our very noses, was a small enclosed yard, in which stood the car which had brought us from the station. An ejaculation from Challenger caused us to turn. He had read his telegrams, and had arranged them in a little methodical pile upon his desk. His broad, rugged face, or as much of it as was visible over the matted beard, was still deeply flushed, and he seemed to be under the influence of some strong excitement.
Well, gentlemen, he said, in a voice as if he were addressing a public meeting, this is indeed an interesting reunion, and it takes place under extraordinary, I may say unprecedented, circumstances. May I ask if you observed anything upon your journey from town?
The only thing which I observed, said Summerlee with a sour smile, was that our young friend here has not improved in his manners during the years that have passed. I am sorry to state that I have had to seriously complain of his conduct in the train, and I should be wanting in frankness if I did not say that it has left a most unpleasant impression in my mind.
Well, we all get a bit prosy sometimes, said Lord John. The young fellow meant no real harm. After all, he's an international, so if he takes a half an hour to describe a game of football, he has more right to do it than most folk.
Half an hour to describe a game!" I cried indignantly. "Why, it was you that took half an hour with some long-winded story about a buffalo. Professor Summerlee will be my witness."
"I can hardly judge which of you was the most utterly wearisome," said Summerlee. "I declare to you, Challenger, that I never wish to hear of football or of buffaloes so long as I live."
"I have never said one word to-day about football," I protested. Lord John gave a shrill whistle, and Summerlee shook his head sadly.
"So early in the day, too," said he. "It is indeed deplorable. As I sat there in sad but thoughtful silence—"
"In silence?" cried Lord John. "Why, you were doing a music-hall turn of imitations all the way. More like a runaway gramophone than a man." Summerlee drew himself up in bitter protest.
"You are pleased to be facetious, Lord John," said he with a face of vinegar.
"Why, dash it all, this is clear madness!" cried Lord John. "Each of us seems to know what the others did, and none of us knows what he did himself. Let's put it all together from the first. We got into a first-class smoker. That's clear, ain't it? Then we began to quarrel over friend Challenger's letter in the Times."
"Oh, you did you?" rumbled our host, his eyelids beginning to droop.
"You said, Summerlee, that there was no possible truth in his contention."
"Dear me,"
said Challenger, puffing out his chest and stroking his beard. "No possible truth. I seem to have heard the words before. And may I ask with what arguments the great and famous Professor Summerlee proceeded to demolish the humble individual who had ventured to express an opinion upon a matter of scientific possibility? Perhaps before he exterminates that unfortunate nonentity, he will condescend to give some reasons for the adverse views which he has formed." He bowed and shrugged and spread open his hands as he spoke with his elaborate and elephantine sarcasm.
"The reason was simple enough," said the dogged Summerlee. "I contended that if the ether surrounding the earth was so toxic in one quarter that it produced dangerous symptoms, it was hardly likely that we three in the railway carriage should be entirely unaffected."
The explanation only brought uproarious merriment from Challenger. He laughed until everything in the room seemed to rattle and quiver. "Our worthy Summerlee is, not for the first time, somewhat out of touch with the facts of the situation," said he at last, mopping his heated brow. "Now, gentlemen, I cannot make my point better than by detailing to you what I have myself done this morning. You will the more easily condone any mental aberration upon your own part when you realize that even I have had moments when my balance has been disturbed. We have had for some years in this household a housekeeper, one Sarah, with whose second name I have never attempted to burden my memory. She is a woman of a severe and forbidding aspect, prim and demure in her bearing, very impassive in her nature, and never known within our experience to show signs of any emotion. As I sat alone at my breakfast, Mrs. Challenger is in the habit of keeping her room of a morning. It suddenly entered my head that it would be entertaining and instructive to see whether I could find any limits to this woman's imperturbability. I devised a simple but effective experiment. Having upset a small vase of flowers which stood in the center of the cloth, I rang the bell and slipped under the table. She entered, and seeing the room empty, imagined that I had withdrawn to the study. As I had expected, she approached and leaned over the table to replace the vase. I had a vision of a cotton stocking and an elastic-sided boot. Protruding my head, I sank my teeth into the calf of her leg. The experiment was successful beyond belief. For some moments she stood paralyzed, staring down at my head. Then, with a shriek, she tore herself free and rushed from the room. I pursued her with some thoughts of an explanation, but she flew down the drive, and some minutes afterwards I was able to pick her out with my field glasses, travelling very rapidly in a southwesterly direction.